One of the things I find in talking to people who know Somalia is they sometimes have to double take when you talk about what's going on now, because many people have a lot of baggage about Somalia, particularly people who were there in the 90s or 10, 15 years ago. And there's a great deal of skepticism that here we have yet another conference with all sorts of wonderful things discussed, but is it really going to make a difference? So what I thought I would talk about is some of the things that's going on and maybe what's different now from what, where Somalia has been in the past. And I guess my overall thesis is that Somalia is traveling in the right direction, albeit from a very fairly low base in terms of institutional capacity, in terms of security, and in many other measurements, but it is definitely traveling in the right direction. Having said that, there is an extraordinary irony at the moment, which is that the conditions facing the people of Somalia are probably worse now than they have been for many years. We have 6.7 million people living in great need and distress, 3.2 million people facing crisis. We have something like 650,000 newly displaced people in the last 6 months. Mercifully, famine has not yet happened, but it's a battle to keep it at bay. People are dying more from disease like cholera and measles and diarrhea than they are from actual malnutrition. And so we've got an enormous human challenge in Somalia, and no one should ever forget that and underestimate it. But the curious thing, this is taking place at a moment of extraordinary political optimism and opportunity. And the real challenge is, how do you bottle that political momentum and translate it into real benefits for the population so that Somalia never faces another crippling drought that it's facing right now? Skepticism about conferences. A lot of people were saying, what's going to be different about yet another conference on Somalia, including the Foreign Secretary. He was the one who kept on saying, this is the 32nd conference on Somalia that he's aware of. I've got to get his list from someone. But there are a few differences between this conference, or at least Somalia now, and the last time there were some of these. There was a conference in London. The first is that the federal state architecture is now more or less in place. There's some things still missing, like the status of Mogadishu and Benadir. There's the regularization of the interim status of a number of federal member states, and there's border issues and so on. But we have a federal state architecture, and that's very important. The second thing is, as the Minister said, we've just been through an electoral process, and I'm glad you called it an electoral process, because it wasn't really an election. It was more an electoral process. It was more a political process with electoral features, I feel. But it delivered a result that has been widely received as legitimate by the population and by the international community. And I would say the other thing we've had in the last month or so is an agreement among Somali leadership on the security architecture. And that is extraordinarily significant as well, because one of the things that we have not focused on for many years is the politics of security. And what this conference did is celebrate an agreement among Somali leadership as to the basis upon which the army, the police, the intelligence forces will be formed, the respective roles and responsibilities of the central government and the federal member states, and so on and so on, affordability, how it's going to be paid for, and so on. So these are very important developments. But I would say that there are, just quickly, 5 big challenges that we collectively now face. The first, of course, is responding to the humanitarian crisis and ramping up capacity as quickly as possible, but then making sure that is done in a way that reduces the likelihood of it occurring again. And this speaks to a much bigger agenda that came out of the Istanbul conference last year, which is identifying smart outcomes to build resilience, getting development and humanitarian actors to work together with security actors, getting some socioeconomic investment, for example, for IDPs and so on. The second big challenge, I would say, is security, of course. AMISOM, as the Minister said, has played an extraordinarily important role, but won't stay forever. The key issue is, can the Somalis take lead responsibility for their own security? And in the past, that has been approached as a sort of technical and military and operational problem, when really it's been a political problem. And that's the breakthrough, Minister, I would say, is you have a political agreement among the Somalis as to how this is going to be done. And then the security pact yesterday was between the international community and the Somalis on how that security architecture will be implemented and how the international community will support that. The third big set of challenges are political, and I would say the centerpiece is the constitutional review. Essentially, the constitution is provisional, and there are many grey areas, such as the relationship of the government and the federal member states when it comes to things like the justice system, or resources and revenues, or the relationship of the parliaments in the regions with the parliament in the centre. There's a lot of stuff to be worked out, the status of Benadir and so on. And that's going to be a very interesting process in the coming months. And part of that is the pathway to one person, one vote elections in 2021, which inevitably is more complicated than it sounds. I'd say the fourth big challenge is the government's own capacity to implement this very ambitious agenda. I've spoken to the Prime Minister, in fact, the day before we came here, and this is his biggest headache. Fantastic plans, a very committed government, got political legitimacy, determined to deal with the drought, determined to move forward on security, to move forward on, but the capacity to do this. And almost there's a sort of call to arms, as it were. Come back to Somalia and help us fix this, is his sort of appeal. The fifth challenge is one that you've alluded to, is the international community going to be really joined up in terms of supporting the Somalis to do this? And here the track record is fairly mixed. I would say in the electoral process, the humanitarian sphere, and I have to pay great credit to the British government, which has really led on the humanitarian response and catalyzed a much broader international activity. But in the security sphere, there is real fragmentation in the international community. There's goodwill, and yesterday everyone was saying, we are going to work together. But really, if you're going to have a coherent security sector in Somalia, you cannot have 8 different training systems and lots of different people providing weapons and lots of different people, whether it's Turks or Emiratis or Brits or Americans or Europeans or UN or Saudis or Sudanese or all the other Ugandans, Ethiopians. Any country that wants to build a coherent security architecture, security establishment, needs a single approach to which everyone contributes. And I see that as the next very big challenge. Thank you.